So we talked about how the different types of conditions at the California missions affected the physical health and the psychological health of the California natives who live there. Okay. Now let's talk about the effect of the War for Independence when Mexico gained its independence from Spain. So the California missions were started under Spanish rule, right? But beginning in 1810, you would have a revolutionary movement start off where Mexico would try to gain its independence from Spain. And the war itself would last for several years, okay? Because of the war going on, the War for Independence, in Mexico, you would have less resources coming to California from Mexico to support the missions. So this has an effect on the native population living in the missions. Why? Because now they can't depend on these supplies that used to come from Mexico. Now they have to be self-sufficient. So that means an increase in the amount of labor that the California natives are doing at the missions. Okay? And it's not just labor for them to take care of themselves. No, because these native workers have to also produce enough food and goods to supply the military who are living at the presidios in California and the Spanish settlers who are living in the pueblos, their towns, such as Los Angeles in California. Okay, so all of that work falls on the shoulders of the California natives who are living at the missions, okay? Because now California has to be more self-sufficient. Not as many supplies are going to make it from Mexico because there's a war going on, the War for Independence, that disrupts things. Okay, and finally, we'll end off with the effects of the restrictions on native culture and living conditions, okay? So we talked about how the missionaries were trying to eliminate various aspects of traditional culture, right? Because they figured that the California Indians were heathens, that they were worshiping false gods, and that's what their ceremonies were. And so they tried to eliminate many aspects of traditional culture and the traditional belief system. Okay, now one aspect of this was traditional dances and ceremonies. Okay, so the missionaries tried to stop this in many cases. So, for example, at the mission in Santa Clara in Northern California, the missionaries banned all traditional dances. This was also the case at Mission San Gabriel in Los Angeles. In particular, in San Gabriel, there was one traditional dance that was banned, and it had a major impact and actually led to an uprising there at the Mission of San Gabriel. Because this traditional dance was meant to guide the spirits of people who had recently died into the next world. Okay, that was the point of this particular dance. And they were not allowed to do this traditional ceremony because the missionaries felt that it was connected to their original religion and they didn't want them to follow those beliefs anymore. They wanted them to convert to Catholicism. So think about this, right? A lot of people are dying at the missions, right? That means a bunch of family members are passing over, and you want those family members, you want their spirits to be guided into the next world. So it's very important that the Tongva were able to do this particular traditional dance, and they were not allowed to do it. So that's hurting the afterlives of their loved ones, or their family members who may have passed over because of the diseases at the missions. And so this led to an uprising, in part, at the Mission San Gabriel, right? And so in many cases, there were aspects of traditional culture that were banned or stopped by the missionaries there at the California missions. Okay. Now, at some of the California missions, traditional dancing was allowed to continue. It just depended on the missionaries that were there at that particular mission, right? And their views on traditional dances. Okay, so for example, at some missions, the dances were used for entertainment if there were visitors who came to that particular mission. Okay, so you have an account of visitors who would come to the missions, and they describe the traditional dances being done by the people, and basically the missionaries would have the California natives do these dances to entertain their guests, right? So in that sense, they were a little more lenient in their perspective on traditional dances. Okay. So there was this attempt to try to stomp out all aspects of traditional culture in many of the missions, and because of these living conditions and the loss of culture and the separation or social isolation of people, especially the women from their families, you have a large amount of stress for the California natives living at the missions, right? And you put that on top of the work, the amount of work that they were doing, this forced labor that went against their idea of what proper work was. And so this is going to contribute to a large amount of stress for California natives, and in some cases to depression, especially with the spread of disease and high death rates. You know, many people are depressed, family members dying, they're stressed out because they're forced to live in these conditions, they have to work, and all of this is contributing to a weakened immune system. Right? So if you're living under great stress and depression, it has an effect on your body as well. And so this may open up more people to getting sick and catching diseases, right? And so this is a problem. It's an ongoing cycle if you think about it, right? So people are living in these conditions, they get stressed, they get depressed, their immune systems get weak, they die, and this contributes to more stress and depression for their family members, and the cycle continues, right? You have people being isolated from their family members. They can't interact in the same way that they normally would in the traditional setting, and that's also contributing to more stress and depression. And in some cases, these conditions would lead women to commit infanticide or abortion of their children. So Native women, in some cases, they were aware of how to have an abortion. Right? They knew they had certain methods, certain herbs that they could take that would allow them to abort their child. And so abortions were common in some of the California missions because they didn't want their child to be born into those circumstances, right? They were horrible living conditions. But that's not the only reason why abortions occurred at the California missions. Another reason was because there was a lot of cases of rape of California Native women by Spanish soldiers. Okay, as I mentioned, there were Spanish soldiers who lived in presidios nearby, and they kept law and order at the missions so that the natives were forced to comply with the wishes of the missionaries. Right? And so a lot of times, these Spanish soldiers would take advantage of Native women, not just ones living at the missions, but also Native women living in their traditional villages. All right, who weren't even living at the California missions. You would have Spanish soldiers getting together in groups, hunting down Native women and then raping them. And then those women would get pregnant, and then they would have abortions because they didn't want this child that was a product of rape. And so that was one of the reasons why you had so many cases of abortion at the California missions. Now, the missionaries did not like the idea of abortion. They're totally against it, right? They're Catholic missionaries. And so they would actually punish women who they felt committed abortions. And it wasn't always that the women committed abortions. It might have been that they were sick. They may have had syphilis, maybe because of the living conditions that they were living in at the time. They had lost the baby, maybe they had a miscarriage. But the missionaries often suspected that the Native women were committing abortion, and so they would actually punish them because they thought that the Native women had an abortion. Okay, and so what were some of the forms of punishment? Well, in some cases, depending on the missionaries, but in some cases, they would force the Native women who had lost a child, whether they committed abortion or not, they would force them to carry around a wooden doll for several days in public. Right? They would have the woman stand in front of the church holding this wooden doll after she had just lost her child, or maybe she really did commit an abortion. Still, that has to have a psychological effect on the woman. And now, afterwards, she's being punished by these missionaries by being forced to hold this wooden doll in public for several days. And so this has a huge psychological impact on women who may have lost their child at the California missions. So overall, you get an idea of what the conditions were like for Native Americans at the California missions. Very unhealthy in many ways. They were separated from their traditional culture. Their social interactions with each other were changed dramatically. They were forced to do labor. and do jobs that they normally didn't do in their traditional lives. Their clothing had changed, their diet had changed. These had effects on their health. They were living in these dense populations that contributed to the spread of disease. Women that were not married were forced to live in these dormitories where it was likely that they were going to get sick. And so this is an example of some of the detrimental impacts on Native Americans who lived in the California missions. And so that brings us to the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me and I will get back to you.